For the better part of 5 years, I traveled around the country talking about the themes from the book Canoeing the Mountains. I love talking about leading change and adaptive change. I love the opportunity to do workshops and equip people for being able to be good leaders. And I really care deeply that leaders will thrive going through change. So, one of the reasons why I wrote the book Tempered Resilience and I gave you this presentation is because what I found is that the greatest challenge of a changing world is not a changing world. It's the resistance of our own people to change for the sake of a changing world. Internal resistance, or what we call sabotage, is the thing that actually is the most soul-sucking reality for most of us as leaders. As we talk about what it takes to survive sabotage and to stand in the middle of the crucible of leadership, you might find that this brings back memories for you of your own experience. I don't intend for this introduction to be a trigger warning. I do intend it to be an invitation, though, to a reality that it can be painful to revisit some of these moments in our lives where we wondered if we were the people who were crazy, if we were the leaders who were doing it wrong. And what we found is that there's just a very human tendency to resist change so deeply that you'll even sabotage that change from the Spirit-inspired leader. So God bless you as you hear this presentation.
Ronald Heifetz of Harvard University gives me, which I think is the very best definition of leadership. He says, leadership is disappointing your own people at a rate they can absorb. You know, I teach leadership formation at Fuller Seminary, and I've been in conversations before with my colleagues about whether even study of leadership is a appropriate topic for a seminary. One of my colleagues, who is an Old Testament professor, said, you know, if you read the Old Testament, you can only find one theology of leadership. And it basically goes like this. If God is leading, things are okay. And when humans lead, they're usually not. I actually think there's more to leadership than that. But I think his point is really well taken. It's hard to find a definition of leadership in the scriptures. And so what we often have to do is compare leadership to another biblical category, and that's the category of management. And while you might think it's hard to find management in the scriptures, think of it instead as stewardship. Management or stewardship is about someone who takes responsibility to take care of things entrusted to their care, as one of my colleagues likes to say. So if you take care of people, or you take care of a church, take care of property, take care of a business, take care of a community, take care in your governing. If you take care of something and care for it in such a way that it's better than when you found it, you've been a good steward, a good manager. And people love good stewards. We praise good managers. We love people who take care of the things that we care about. So this is why when I was a pastor, I used to always think that what I really wanted whenever I was trying to hire a youth leader was actually a youth manager. If you take 10 kids to camp, you got to bring 10 kids home. 90% is not an A. And I knew this myself because every single year I used to take a group of kids to Half Dome in California. In Yosemite National Park, we would get up early in the morning and a group of kids and I would hike 9 miles uphill to where we finally came to the base of the iconic mountain Half Dome, where then using the cables that were put in the side of the rock, we would pull ourselves to the top and have an amazing and inspiring view. I remember the very first year we did it, I discovered that those kids who'd been spent all summer preparing for fall sports were in great shape. And the rest of us mere mortals were having a hard time trying to keep up. And when we finally got to the base, Eric, who is one of the kids who is in particularly great shape, he'd been waiting at the base of the mountain for some time now, and he and a group of friends were already getting bored and tired. And they looked at me and they said, Pastor Todd, could we do something? Would it be okay if a group of us went up to the top and we found a place to have a picnic, and we'll just wait till the rest of you get there before we eat? But because we know you'll have to stay back with the other and make sure all the kids get up there. I said, go ahead, you guys go on up top, and I'll be up with the stragglers in a few minutes. Well, it was about 45 minutes when I got up there. And by the time we got up to the top, I found when I got up there was Eric sitting at the top of Half Dome with his feet dangling over the edge, 3,000 feet below him. I grabbed him, I pulled him back, and I looked at him and I said, Eric, you don't understand. If you fall off, you'll go see Jesus. I'll have to see your mother. That is way worse for me. Because a parent expects you to take care of your kid. Parents expect that we will take care of these people, these children who have been entrusted to our care. And when we do so, people appreciate us. They love us. They praise us. Management is taking care of the things entrusted to our care, passing them on to other people. It's taking care of the traditions, the doctrines, the texts, the teachings. Being a good manager means taking people where they need to go and want to go, and when you do so, they thank you. Being a leader means taking people where they need to go and want to go, and very often they resist going. I want to talk about how we lead in the face of resistance, because this is the most difficult part of leadership for most of us as Christians. Ed Friedman, who was a Jewish rabbi who led a synagogue in the area of Washington, D.C., who was a marriage and family systems therapist. He used Bowenian systems theory, both in his practice with families, but also to look at churches and synagogues as organizational family systems. And he was a consultant in Washington, D.C., so he saw dysfunction at every level. He described once what it was like to talk to leaders. And this is what he described. He said, they had become so focused on their aches and pains in the system that they had been thrown off course by the complaints. They had stopped supplying vision or had burned out fighting the resistance. They had ceased to be the strength in the system. In short, they had forgotten the lead. For the past 5 years, at least pre-COVID, I had gone around the country talking to groups about leading change, about the necessity of leading in uncharted territory, about the kind of leadership that is needed if we're going to continue to live out the mission of God in a rapidly changing world. What I found is whenever I would go talk about this subject, what most people always wanted to talk about was the resistance to their leadership. What I found is the most soul-sucking part of being a leader wasn't the rapidly changing world all around us. It was resistance of our own people when you called them to the transformation necessary to continue to bring the gospel to a rapidly changing world all around us. Friedman called this sabotage. He said, if you're a leader, expect sabotage. Think of it this way. The word family and the word familiar are the same root word. What it means is that if you're in unfamiliar territory, that you're literally experiencing the experience of being unfamilied. It means that when we're in unfamiliar territory, we're not just disoriented, we feel abandoned. We get highly anxious. And more than anything, we want to stop and go back. We're like the kid in the grocery store who gets so caught up looking at the back of the cereal box that he doesn't even notice that mom and dad have moved on to the next aisle. He drops the box and does everything he can to run to mama. And that's exactly the experience that so many of our congregations are having in this uncharted, disrupted world. When we start talking about needing to change and we start getting ourselves into unfamiliar territory, everything within us wants to run home, which means that even as a leader, when you've led people to have courage to move into the future, very often they will stop that very process and at times do that in the name of God. If you're a leader, he says, expect sabotage. Indeed, he says that the most important aspect of leadership is the ability to skillfully deal with sabotage. The capacity of a leader to be prepared for, to be aware of, and learn how to deal with sabotage may be, he said, the most important aspect of leadership. It's literally the key to the kingdom. Listen to how Friedman describes this. This is probably different than the way you and I think of sabotage. He says, the important thing to remember about the phenomenon of sabotage is that it is a systemic part of leadership. It's part and parcel of the leadership process. Another way of putting this is that a leader can never assume success because he or she has brought about a change. It is only after having first brought about a change and then subsequently endured the resultant sabotage that the leader can feel truly successful. I'm a Presbyterian, which means that we believe somehow that the God's Spirit works best with Robert's Rules of Order. We believe that in Pentecost, if someone had been there with a proper stated clerk, they would have been taking votes about all of the things happening. What it means for us is when we want to bring change, we believe that change happens through rational debate and then a vote. And if you get 50% plus one vote, well, then the Holy Spirit poured out upon you and the changes come. And so for most of us as leaders, we believe that the key to bringing change is getting the votes, convincing enough people, getting enough people to want to go along with us. And as soon as people say yes, well, we're on our way. What Friedman would say is true leadership needs to recognize it's more like this. You get the votes, they agree to the change, they start the change, and then there will be sabotage. And you haven't been successful in bringing change until after you've survived the sabotage that comes 100% of the time. For Friedman, sabotage is normal. It's natural. It's to be expected. Sabotage is not the bad things that evil people do, but the human things that anxious people do. When we get anxious, we want to go back to what is familiar. We want to stop the transformation. We want to get back into something that feels like home. And when we are going through rapid disorientation of the world around us, and then we have to respond to it with our own transformation, everything within us, consciously and unconsciously, wants to put a stop to it. Remember, this is normal. It's natural. It's to be expected. It's not the bad things that evil people do. It's the human things that anxious people do. And we see it even in the scriptures. Remember the biggest story in the Hebrew scriptures is the story of the Exodus, right? I mean, you remember Exodus chapter 13, the great Passover meal. The people of God are freed after 400 years of slavery in that brutal night where the angel of death struck down the firstborn, but spared the people of God because the blood of the Lamb was over the door. They find themselves finally released from their slavery. Pharaoh says they can go, and they start heading toward the promised land. In Exodus 13, God says that he knows their hearts, that he knows they're fearful people. He knows that if they run into their ancient foes, the Philistines, they might lose heart and want to go back. So he sends them another route, and he sends them right into the cul-de-sac, that is the Red Sea. 600,000 of them find themselves facing the sea in front of them, only to look over their shoulder and see chariots coming after them. Pharaoh decides that he's not going to lose this economic engine of 600,000 slaves, and he sends his charioteers to bring them back. And caught there between the sea and the chariots, they do what we all do. They blame the leader. You know, Moses, this whole freedom thing was really your idea. We were pretty happy, all things considered. Maybe we can go back and have a negotiation with Pharaoh now that he knows we're serious. Maybe he'll take us back. Maybe it won't be quite so bad. You know, it really would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness, they say. Moses tells them to stand firm, to see what God will do. He raises up his staff in his hands, and the Red Sea parts. And they, 600,000 of them, go across on dry land with the waters held back. They end up on the other side, only to see the charioteers come in after them. They look back then to see the waters released, and the chariots and chariot drivers wash up dead on the beach, and they are freed. Exodus 14:31. So the people believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. This is the greatest miracle that would be seen until the resurrection of Jesus himself. They go into a praise song and they sing another. It's 2 worship songs, and then they head into the promised land on their journey. Exodus 15 is 2 praise songs and a little statement that said that they began to look for lunch. In the next 6 weeks, they discover for the very first time what they didn't realize: they'd be in a wilderness, that they would be camping. This might not be as comfortable as they expected. And 6 weeks later, 6 weeks after the parting of the Red Sea, 6 weeks after the death of the Egyptian army, 6 weeks after this amazing miracle that demonstrated the power of God, 6 weeks later, we read, the whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses. You know, yeah, we were in slavery, and sure, they killed our children, but we had leeks and onions for lunch. Maybe we should go back. Moses cries out to God. God delivers them food. He gives them manna every morning to remind them that not only has he saved them, but he is providing for them. Not only is he leading them in the pillar of clouds and the pillar of fire, but that he is taking care of them. And every day they wake up to experience the manna that will feed them on the journey. This moment is a moment that Moses had to face the resistance of his people with faith that would continue to move them forward. Ed Friedman says that this moment was a temptation of Moses to a failure of nerve. A failure of nerve is when we so want to please our people, when we become so caught up in their anxiety, when we find ourselves so overwhelmed by their resistance that we want to cave to the pressure and return to the status quo. A failure of nerve is where we stop the transformation process, where we stop the journey and instead slow down or maybe even return back. When we find ourselves making excuses for why we can't change and how we need to protect the status quo and how we have to be careful about change fatigue or going too fast or going too far. Many of us as leaders are tempted to the failure of nerve. Moses overcomes it by turning to God and by helping his people see God's provision in the middle of this challenging moment. But a few months later, Moses would suffer from a different failure. In Numbers chapter 11, the people grumble again. And this time they grumble not because they have no food, but because they are now getting bored of the miracle that God provides every morning. They are getting tired of the manna, and they start to grumble, wishing that, at least in slavery, remember the flesh pots of Egypt? Remember the leeks and onions? And this time Moses hears them, and instead of crying out to God for provision, he gets angry, and he goes to God and says to God, God, if you're going to leave me with these people, you can kill me now. You can put me to death. If this is all the people, if this is who I have to lead, well, take me out. Maybe you never felt that way, or maybe sometime during COVID you did. Maybe you never said, put me to death, but you might have said, God, if this is the people you want me to pastor, I could sell real estate. I could sell life insurance. I could teach biology. I could coach basketball. You know what I always think? I always think I could be a national park ranger. I could do trail maintenance. I could travel around through the national parks picking up stray cigarette butts and stray tin cans. I could make the place look better, and I could spend my whole day in the beauty of nature and never talk to another complaining human being. Some of us struggle with a failure of nerve. I'm one of those who, like Moses, struggled with a failure of heart. It's when your own discouragement leads you to cynicism. And after a while, disappointment leads to disconnection, when it can lead you to start to abandon your people and to the charge that you've been given. My friend Jimmy Miato is the president for Compassion International. Jimmy likes to say, the big danger of doing the work of God is that it can undo God's work in you. And maybe this far into the pandemic, some of you are beginning to experience, maybe you have found yourself with a failure of nerve or a failure of heart. Maybe you found yourself going along and colluding with those who were the most anxious, those who wanted the most familiar, those who wanted to return home to mama, and you just wanted to take care of them and stay with them. And if nothing else, get them to keep from complaining about you. Or maybe you found yourself angry, mad, cynical, disconnected, a failure of heart. Most often, friends, the cause for a changed leader's failure of nerve or failure of heart is the internal resistance of our people. It's sabotage. Far more painful for a leader than the rapidly changing world all around us is the resistance of our own people near us. Far more discouraging than trying to come up with new and creative ideas to take the gospel in a world that is beginning to become disconnected from God is how painful it is when the very people of God who called you to lead them then turn on you when you try to. When you come up with a new idea, when you take on a new initiative, when you try to do something new and creative, when you try to bring transformation and change that will help the gospel go forth in a rapidly changing world, and you find yourself facing the sullen glances, the passive-aggressive looks, the crossed arms, the disappointment that you don't more deeply care for them. Don't you know how hard this is on us? They say. Failure of nerve, failure of heart. What's the bigger challenge for you? Think back on a time when you experienced sabotage. Think back on a time when you were trying hard to be faithful to the call of God with your congregation. Maybe you were leading it. Maybe you were part of a committee. Maybe you started a new initiative or you took on a new challenge. You believed this was the Spirit of God at work. It inspired something within you. You said yes to the call. And then all of a sudden you found that soon you are alone. Or maybe even the very people who invited you to come and to do this work, to lead this initiative, became the people who began to resist, unwilling to go with you, sometimes actively stopping the work you were doing. How did it impact you personally and as a leader? Try to remember as concretely as possible, because this is the most challenging part of trying to lead into uncharted territory, is that when we finally have the will to start thinking creatively and differently, to not default to our training, but to try to learn, to face losses, to move forward, and we find the resistance of our own people holding us back. What is needed in the face of resistance is resilience. For the better part of the last 5 years, I went around the country, first literally physically, and then this last year through webinars. And I talked to people about trying to lead change in a rapidly changing world. And very, very often I would get people who would come to me and say, the hard part about this is, I had a district superintendent in the Methodist Church say to me, I don't know if we have anybody who can actually do this. I don't know if we have anybody who has the stomach for this. One of my coaching clients said to me, Todd, I think I can learn to lead change. I'm not sure I can survive it. And another one said to me, Todd, my inbox is a terrible place to be. No matter what decision I make, somebody's mad at me. It's taken a toll on me. You've probably seen the statistics. More and more people are dropping out of ministry every day. More and more churches are beginning to fold up shop. More of us are beginning to wonder whether or not we can even survive this pandemic, let alone thrive through it. What does it take to be able to survive and thrive, to face the challenges and move forward, to face the changing world and to stand strong in the face of the resistance of our own people? Well, what's needed is resilience. There's lots of definitions of resilience. Andrew Zolli writes about resilience, and he writes about the resilience of cultures or nations, those who've had to overcome things like genocide or ecological catastrophes. And he defines resilience this way. He says resilience is the capacity to maintain core purpose and integrity in the face of dramatically changed circumstances. Maintain core purpose and integrity in the face of dramatically changed circumstances. I don't know if you spend more than 5 minutes with me, you're going to know that the verb maintain is not a word that gets me out of bed in the morning. I am not a maintain kind of guy, but maintaining core purpose, maintaining integrity, staying true to the things that we believe we are called to do, staying true to our mission, true to our word, true to our identity, true to our values, to hold on and maintain those in the face of a dramatically changed circumstance. Well, that's worth getting out of bed in the morning. August 28th, 1963, 250,000 people gathered in front of the Lincoln Memorial. They gathered that day on a march on Washington for freedom and jobs. 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, 250,000 mostly African-American citizens and their allies gathered together in front of the Lincoln Memorial to make a statement that it was time for the United States of America to make good on its promises of freedom to its African-American citizens. That 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, that this incredible group of African-American citizens were still not entirely free. All day long, there were speeches until finally the speech that they were all waiting for. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was introduced as the moral leader of the nation. And he stood before that group and he gave a speech that we've now come to know as the I Have a Dream speech. Here's an interesting thing. The I Have a Dream section was not in his speech, at least not originally. He had been up the night before with his speechwriter, Clarence B. Jones. They'd been up till 4 a.m. working on this speech. They wanted to hit the right note of honest, sober realism, of prophetic call, without doing anything that could ever be accused of inciting people to violence or to uprising. They wanted it to be scholarly and clear and calm. Dr. King used the analogy of a bad check, that the United States of America had given a promissory note to its African-American citizens, and it had been returned insufficient funds. And it was now time for them to make good on their promises. It was time for the United States of America to pay up. He launched into his speech, and a few minutes in, when he hit a line that he thought would have a response, he paused for just a second. And when he did, he heard behind him the gospel singer Mahalia Jackson. She was sitting there in the crowd behind him. She had sung earlier in the program. She'd heard Dr. King several times. They'd traveled together and worked together. And in the middle of that silence, that small moment, when she heard him stop, she yelled, "Tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream." He slid his notes across the lectern. Clarence B. Jones turned to the person next to him and said, "These people don't know it, but they're about to go to church." And he launched into a vision that comes right out of Isaiah 40. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is the faith that I go back to the South with. Think about that line for just a minute. 250,000 people, not many of them had come from the South. Many of them had come from the lunch counters and the protests and the marches and the dogs and the hoses and the jails. He looks at these folks and he says to them in a way that only a preacher could, who's walked with them through the journey, because I believe that a day is coming when God is going to make justice part of the very molecules of the earth, that God is going to restore creation down to the dirt. Because I believe that a day is going to come when all is going to be made right, and when all flesh shall see the glory of the Lord revealed. We go back to the South. We go back to the lunch counters and the marches and the protests and the dogs and the hoses and the jails. With this faith, he says, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we'll be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. For those of you who preach, you know this is a masterclass in parallelism. It's where you take two sentences to make one point, and it's all the richer for making it. It's where you entwine together the concepts of hewing and transformation to capture what's needed in this moment. What do you do when you're facing a mountain of despair? What do you do when you're facing a 400-year-old mountain of despair? You don't bash it with a sledgehammer. You don't blow it up with a dynamite, and you don't back down. You hew it. You transform it. You hew out of that mountain of despair stones of hope. I don't know about you, but I can't read this passage without thinking about 1 Peter. Come to him, a living stone, and let yourselves as living stones be built into a dwelling place for God. Let yourselves be built into a place where the glory of the Lord is revealed, the presence of God is seen. Can you dare to believe that the very place where we have the most amount of despair can, through our own transformative work, become the arena for the presence of God to be seen in the world, for the glory of the Lord to be revealed for all flesh to see? Can you possibly believe that this very moment of despair can actually become the arena for hope? With this faith, we'll be able to hew out of a mountain of despair a stone of hope. So how do we become a tool that can hew? A tool that can hew is like a chisel. It's not a sledgehammer. It's a tempered tool. It's a tool that has been shaped and formed in such a way that it is stronger than the raw material, but it's also more flexible. It has a capacity to both break through and carve around, to bring transformation, not destruction. How do we become a tool that can hew? How do we become a tempered tool? This is what I call tempered resilience. Tempered resilience is both strong and flexible, both courageous and enduring and wise. A tempered resilience is a grounded identity. It is a resilient character, and it is shaped through reflection, relationships, and a rule of life, in a rhythm of leading and not leading. Reflection, relationships, and a rule of life in a rhythm of leading and not leading. In the same way that steel becomes a tempered tool through a process, leaders become a tempered tool through a formation process. In Los Angeles, where I live, there is an urban blacksmithing community shuttled away in a section of the city where there hasn't been a horse there in 100 years. There are artisanal blacksmiths. You can sign up for blacksmithing classes. And since I was studying about tempered tools, I decided to do so. Matter of fact, I took 2. When you walk into this place, you realize that this is a place that serious work is done. You go in there wearing jeans and a t-shirt. They give you ear protection. That's it. I thought I'd get chain mail or leather gloves or some big helmet or something or goggles. No, just ear protection. They make you sign your name on a clipboard on a document that says that you understand that this is dangerous, that this can kill you, or it can at least take a limb or two. And then they hand you a pair of tongs and a piece of steel, and they tell you to use the tongs to put the steel into the forge, and you're blacksmithing. It struck me in this moment that this is the experience of every leader I know. That it feels like that as soon as you've walked into leadership, you have become the kind of person who is going to go through a transformation, and that this transformation happens before you know it. We barely had a safety lecture and we were blacksmithing. And yet this is the way that so many of us have experienced leadership in this time, isn't it? This is the first principle for becoming a tempered leader. It's the first thing I learned when I went into the blacksmithing shop. Leaders are formed in leading. Leaders are formed in leading. You've got to enter the shop. You've got to enter into the conflict. You've got to go into the place of the resistance. You've got to take on the responsibility. You can't learn leadership from a book or a class, says the guy who wrote a book and teaches classes. You can learn some techniques or tools or tips. You can learn some principles or practices, but you're not beginning to be formed into a leader until you're already in the shop, right in the middle of the process. This is one of the reasons why facing sabotage or resistance that happens in the middle of the leadership process is so difficult. There was no way really to prepare for it until you are facing it. Remember, everybody who becomes a leader of anything, is usually asked to lead because they were a success at something right before that was not leading. Right? You're a success at something that's not leading, and that's what helps you become a leader. So you're a really good speaker, and so they ask you to preach, and after a few sermons, they ask you to be the pastor. And you go from being a person who might be pretty good with biblical texts and speaking to being a person who has to lead other people. You're the best salesperson, and they make you the sales manager. You're the best scholar, and they make you the dean of the school. In our school, when we had our new dean, who's an amazing man, people talked about the fact that he had a 20-page CV. That's the academic document that lists everything he'd ever written. 20 pages of citations of articles and books and chapters of books that he'd written, research he'd done for years and years and years. Because he was the most accomplished scholar, we said he'll be a great dean. But think about it for a second. And he's a really fine dean. He's remarkable. But for most of us, if you spent most of your life compiling a 20-page CV, that meant you spent most of your life in libraries, surrounded by people who give you a completely environmentally controlled environment, a temperature-controlled, environment-controlled, so that everything is maximized for you to be able to be left alone and read and study and write. The exact opposite of being a leader, right? This is why leadership is so hard, especially leadership in uncharted territory. To take people into the unfamiliar means that they're going to get anxious and angry and mad, and often they're anxious and angry and mad at you. It's why when you set a vision before people for transformation, you find that you spend most of your time with their resistance to the very vision they agreed to in the first place. Leaders are formed in the leading. And so facing sabotage becomes one of the primary responsibilities for leaders. It's a process of transformation. This process is the process that all of us go through. Just in the same way that the steel has to go through heating and holding and hammering and quenching in a repetitive way, leaders have to develop the capacity for reflection, relationships, spiritual and leadership practices, the rhythm of release of leadership responsibilities. Reflection, relationships, a rule of life in a rhythm of leading and not leading. Heating, holding, hammering, quenching, reflection, relationships, practices, and a slow release of leadership and rest. It's a process of transformation and a process that's critical to the work that we do. When you go into the blacksmithing shop, you realize that not only is there a process of transformation, but it's really important that you start with good raw material. That there's something really important about the steel and the quality of the steel if you're going to turn it into a good tool. And while there's lots of formational capacities that we will add to become resilient leaders, that we need to be teachable or humble, attuned, empathic, adaptable and creative, tenacious and gritty, that what matters underneath it all is that we have a grounded identity. In the leadership literature about how people can survive sabotage, how they can continue to lead in the face of resistance, there is this kind of overwhelming shared experience of the very best leaders, the strongest leaders, the leaders who are able to overcome both the failure of nerve and the failure of heart are grounded leaders. They are leaders who are grounded. For people to lead well, they must be grounded in something other than their success in leading change. This is why for those of us who desperately need to be successful, that we often become brittle. Those of us who have a tendency to want to appear successful actually end up becoming the people who are quickest to break. You need a grounded identity. If you want to lead people through transformation and change, you have to be grounded in something other than their success in leading change. You've got to be grounded in something bigger even than your leadership. And one of the reasons we know this is because we see this in the life of Jesus. Here's Mark chapter 1 from the Message version. At this time, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee. At this time. At what time? At this time. Early in the ministry, before he had done anything, before he preached a single sermon, before he'd done a single miracle, before he cast out a demon, before he confronted a single power, before he had done anything at all that would identify him to be the Messiah, before he had done anything at all that would identify him as the King and Lord and Savior of all, before he had done anything at all, before he'd called a single disciple, before he had done a single task, before he'd accomplished anything, at this time, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. The moment he came out of the water, he saw the sky split open and God's Spirit like a dove come down on him, along with the Spirit of voice. You are my Son, chosen and marked by my love, pride of my life. You are my beloved, chosen and marked by my love, pride of my life. What had Jesus done that had made God proud of him? Nothing. He was already beloved. He's already the child in whom God was well pleased, already marked by his love, pride of God's life. Dear friends, if you're going to be leaders who can lead change in a changing world, who can stand and hear the call of God to take the people of God into the future, to leave behind the status quo of the past and to move into the formational experience of being transformed for the mission of God as it goes into the world, then you must be grounded in something other than your success at leading change, because you will be resisted. It will be difficult. You will experience sabotage. It will be soul-sucking. You will be tempted toward a failure of nerve so that people will approve of you, or a failure of heart so that you can defend yourself against the disappointment. And what you need instead is to be able to become a resilient, a tempered, resilient leader. Someone who is strong and flexible, who is courageous and wise, who has the capacity to continue to lead, because deep within them they start with a grounded identity that is grounded in something more than your own need for being a success. Some years ago, many years ago, a buddy and I decided that we wanted to do one of those crazy things that we would check off our bucket list. We We started exercising, and pretty soon we heard inspiring stories of people who not only ran, but also ran and biked and swam, and they did it all in the same day. They did this crazy thing called the Ironman, where you train to get your body into the condition where you can swim about 2.5 miles, and then you jump on your bike and you ride it for over 100, and then you run a marathon, 26 miles, and you do it all in one day. And a buddy and I decided that we would just give ourselves to it. We were two pretty big guys who would know we'd have to go really slow. But 3 years later, we found ourselves in Canada at Lake Penticton, suited up and starting the Ironman. We couldn't believe that we were there. The night before, we had been at the competitors' dinner, and we used competitor was a loose term. We saw ourselves as participants. This is just a bucket list thing for us. But as we sat at the dinner eating pasta with all of these, some of whom were highly competitive, who are trying to qualify for the world championships or win their age groups or set a world record, we found ourselves just basking in it all, taking pictures, thinking about how fun it was that we're going to spend this wild day tomorrow, hoping that we can make it. And right in the middle of the hubbub, they quieted the crowd and they asked for attention because they said they had someone who they wanted to come speak to us. And they invited her up. And she was a Catholic nun. But she wasn't just a Catholic nun, she was Iron Nun. Her name is Sister Madonna Buter. And Sister Buter is the world record holder in her age group. A Catholic nun who is the world record holder in her age group, which is Ironman athletes over 80. And she stood in front of that crowd and she quieted them down and she said to them, I want you to remember that tomorrow could be a hard day. That some of you have traveled miles and some of you have trained for months. And tomorrow it could go wrong. You could find yourself in a depressing and difficult moment. And you could find yourself discouraged by the task in front of you. And you're going to be tempted to give up and despair. Your body may break down. Your spirit might be quenched. You might find yourself overwhelmed. And at that moment, what I want you to remember is that you were loved into existence. You were loved into existence. I remember sitting there looking at my buddy, both of us Presbyterian pastors, thinking this is the best sermon we'd heard in months. To be reminded, even when you're trying to do something that feels impossible, that your success is not what matters most, because you were already loved into existence. Because you're loved, she was saying, go out and face the course tomorrow. The next day, in the middle of the run, I was busy trying to keep my focus as I kept going. I'd been out there for hours, and all of a sudden I heard a voice behind me, and someone yelled, "Sister, sister!" I turned around, and there she was. And a woman who was struggling yelled out to Sister Buter, who was herself a competitor, and said, "Sister, pray for me." And Madonna Buter stopped and walked back and took her hand and said, "Let's walk for a while, hon. We'll do this together." That year, Sister Madonna Buter didn't qualify for the Ironman Championships in Hawaii, as she usually did, because she walked alongside someone who was having a hard time, holding her by the hand and reminding her that you were loved into existence. The most difficult thing for me speaking to you as leaders here in this crazy Zoom world is that I can't walk up to you and shake your hand and remind you that in trying to lead change, you are not alone. That it will be difficult. That your own people might even turn on you. That you will experience their anxiety as resistance. That they are fearful. They're not bad. They're anxious. They want the familiar. And they might even turn against you. But you were loved into existence. Remember, you are grounded in something larger than your own success. And even more important than you're a leader is that you are loved. So keep on. Let God's work continue to transform you. Amen.
You were loved into existence. Sister Madonna said to all of us gathered that day in Canada before we took on this silly thing called the Ironman. I don't remember my time, and I have a hard time to remember many of the things of that day, but I do remember well that sermon. You were loved into existence. It's this reminder that especially when you're leading change, especially when you're having to disappoint people, especially when they resist your very leadership because of their own anxiety, you've got to remember that you are already loved, that you don't have to be successful at leading change to be loved, and that this is really at the heart of the gospel. I will sometimes say to people that I'm coaching, if this is hard for you to believe, that you can be grounded in something other than your success and your accomplishments, then please believe the gospel. Believe the good news that Jesus Christ knows you and loves you and called you by name, died on the cross for you, forgives you, and lives within you by the power of the Holy Spirit. And there is nothing you need to do to deserve that. Believe in grace, and the grace of God will be for you the most important grounding reality for you to be faithful in the face of resistance and change and even sabotage. God bless you as you do.